Good morning and welcome to the April edition of Textile of the Month Club. We'll be talking about Kumihimo and Kumiori this morning. So first of all, I'd like to, let me back up just a little bit there. I'd like to show you an image of the Shosoin in Kyoto. This is the oldest continuously in use building in the world. Now, of course, they changed out timber over time and so forth, but it's the treasure house, basically dating back to about the 600s. So contained within this treasure house are a number of articles we'll be talking about today. Kumihimo goes all the way back to this time and, of course, was well developed before samples were stored there. This is a reproduction of one of the pieces in the shosoin, a very beautifully knotted piece with additional embellishments. This is another reproduced piece, and you can see along the edges here what we think of as typical kumihimo, along with this center section here. So it's illustrating very different types of knotting techniques. So in ancient times, remember, or all the way up to fairly modern times, kumihimo was used anytime you needed a rope, basically, a decorative rope. So there were times, of course, it was used as belts. In contemporary times, it's used as obi and so forth. But also it was used to package things as decorative items in temples. Anytime you needed a sash, a rope, a cord, or in the case of the image you see here, this is a section of Japanese samurai samurai armor. And you can see the plates here are wood that have been lacquered. And then these different plates of wood have been laced together with the kumihimo to allow the plate to have movement and flexibility for the person wearing it. So this was another typical use. There are several different kinds of equipment used for knotting kumihimo. Perhaps commonly seen as the maru-dai, certainly in this country. It's round, maru means round, and you can see that basically there's a dance that goes on, a choreographed arrangement of how the threads, how the cords are braided back and forth, back and forth. You can see here that, well, let me stop for just a moment. There's this cord that's coming from underneath. That's the kumihimo. With a maru-dai, the cord always exits the bottom of the stand. And this weight here, let me back up just a minute and you can see this clip. Okay, so right here, you can see the weight is attached to the cord itself. And then you have this extra bit to it. Now, the weight of this particular pole balances out to be the same as the combined total of all of those spools. And so what happens is, as the craftsperson knots, it allows the thread to drop down just a bit, just one thread's worth, and the weight pulls it through. And again and again. Now, what keeps it from slipping all the way through is the fact that all these bobbins are holding and pulling from the outside as the artist moves them about. So this gives you a little bit better shot of that. Okay. And here again, we see it exiting through the bottom of the stand. So you can see that this allows for a great deal of creativity in terms of the dance you choose to perform with the bobbins. And here's another shot of it. The kumihimo cord that we saw a moment ago is round. This one's flat and has this image very similar to that we saw in the shosoin piece just a moment ago. Again, exiting through the bottom. Now, normally the cord would not come up through the hole at the top, but this is done so that you have a good idea of seeing the finished knotted piece along with all the colors that were used to produce it. The second type is called a kakudai. Kaku means it means corner, square, rectangular piece. And here she's doing basically the same thing. You can create very similar types of cording as you can with the maru-dai. The difference here, as you'll notice, is that the cording is going upwards. It's going through the top. So this round bulbous portion there is actually what the cording is resting upon. Here, this is a better shot of it. Now, as each one of those cords are manipulated, it pushes the cord up by just that thread's worth. The weights then that are at the top this time pull the entire piece up and keep it feeding. And of course, that's counterbalanced by the weights of the bobbins themselves, as it was in the earlier piece. And of course, she can let the extra cord out if she needs it. You don't want too much cord out. It'll just get tangled in your way. So it's released a bit at a time as necessary. And if you follow this up now, this is this clamp that you're seeing here is commonly used in sewing, hand sewing. It's called a third hand in English, or sometimes an Elizabethan nightingale. And you can get it at any store that carries equipment for hand sewing. It's produced by Clover, a Japanese sewing company. Now, if you follow that cord up again, the weights are pulling the cord up as it's knotted, counterbalanced by the bobbins, as I mentioned earlier. And so here what you see happening is the cord, this apparatus holding the Kumihimo cord, is going up to the top here. And if we follow that over, you'll see it goes around this pulley section. And that in turn comes down towards the bottom here, where you see additional weights. And again, those weights are calibrated to offset the weight of the bobbin so that the knotted cord advances incrementally and keeps it positioned on the top of that blob. Then there's a third type called an ayatake dai. Ayatake is this board, this stick that is used to help keep the sections of the thread separated. It's called a lease or a lace in weaving terms, and it's used to pick the warp threads apart. It's used to hold them in place. It's used to raise them so that you can weave between and so forth, as you see here. It's also used to pound the thread into place. Okay, and so here she's creating a flat one. And if you'll notice, what I'll point out is earlier, the threads were going around and around as they spiraled down. In this case, even though they're braided, they're creating more or less a straight line across so that the lace can beat it up flat, almost as if, well, just as if you were weaving, actually. And then earlier, where we saw the bobbins draped over the edges of both the marudai and the kakedai to keep them in place, here what you're seeing is that the cords are placed within these different spacer notches to keep the order in alignment. Okay, yet again, she's still braiding just as she was earlier and beating the threads tight. You want a very dense, hard, firm type of a weave to this. Now we're dealing with yet another variety here. This is called a takadai. This is our fourth type. This one is used to create more fabric-like, yardage-like, flat type of pieces for the most part. Okay, and what you'll notice, taka means tall or high or upraised, okay, and quite often a very large one, the craftsperson the knotter will be sitting quite a bit off the floor to allow everything to dangle off the sides. The other thing I'll ask you to notice are the little pegs along the side, and these pegs are used to separate and keep the bobbins in order. And you'll notice that she's picking up the bobbins going right and left as she'll use her hands to manipulate the threads to open them up, place the new bobbin through, take it to the opposite side and place it in its proper order and beat everything into position to give you a nice firm weave. Okay, and as she goes along like with this, you'll notice that there is a level of white threads and below that a level of red threads to keep them dancing separately. Now, I don't actually know the sample, but normally what would happen in this case is the bottom side would be the reverse. So on the top where you have white background with red patterning, the bottom side that we're not seeing would be red with white patterning. And so she'll go along. You can see that the bobbins are draped over the side. Okay, and this gives you a little bit of a close-up. The other thing I'll ask you to notice is that this is forming a diagonal shape rather than straight, as we saw earlier. Now, what happens as she picks up these threads and moves them over, they all dance one at a time further down the line. Well, eventually you run out of pegs. And so there's a very clever solution to that, which you'll see in just a moment. Okay, you see how she put that up from the point furthest away from her and repositioned it on the edge closest to her as they're dancing along. Now here, this artist also is using her fingers to pick apart the different threads that she can then pull the bobbin between to create her knotting. I mean, it really is weaving in its own sense. Pick that bobbin up, pull it through, and place it at the farthest end close to her. And do this over and over again as she beats them into position. Okay, same thing here again. Now, this is something I'd like you to take note of. Let me back up just a tiny bit here. So I mentioned that she picks up the threads and moves them over. And of course, they all eventually dance down and you run out of pegs. Well, when that happens, you pick up this little caboose that you wind up with and reposition it to the front of the line, such as she's doing here, and you keep going. Everything gets moved down. So that way you continuously have a fresh set of pegs to make use of. And of course, then they'll dye all of the yarns for it, hand dye them, beautiful shades. They can be variegated or solid color. You'll be using a wide range of thicknesses of threads too, depending on the effect you're after. And this will give you a sampling of just some of the variation that falls within each color range. So here we are with a close-up again. You can see the diagonal lines, and this is especially good shot of how you wind up with this diagonal, okay, in the weave itself. This is some of Suzuki Midori's artistry, and you can see that she's doing much wider pieces. She's doing neckties, she's doing stoles and scarves and so forth. And so this type of a loom, especially a larger scale one, very much lends itself to making more yardage-like rather than cord-like bits of fabric. So when it's a cord, when it's a tie like that, it's called kumi-himo. Himo means cord. And when it's more of this weaving style, it's called kumi-ori. Ori means weaving. So now a few things from my collection. I have a set of the different stands, marudai, kakudai, and then the takadai all together. And they come with sets of directions. And so here you can tell just by looking at the shape, of course, that this is going to be a marudai. And what it has plotted out for you are where each cord should go. And of course, you decide your own colors and the order in which they are repositioned, the rhythm they follow. It's a little bit like an Arthur Murray dance studio thing where you might have footsteps on the floor to follow to help you to learn how to dance. Well, this is the same thing. Each of these cards, called a shikishi, these are cardboard cards that are often, you'll find them with commonly used for Japanese paintings or calligraphy that are then framed. These are simply sets of directions that will stay rigid so that you can have it by your side to follow as you go along and execute the choreography of your knotting, a little bit like having, say, a knitting chart next to you as you work away. Okay, and this will keep track. And you can see here that there's 1, 2, 3, and you simply follow it in order and then repeat back again, just like in a square dance where everybody winds up back at their original set and you start again. So now you see there is the kakudai with the square format, and then that'll lead into the other ones in terms of takadai and also the ayatakedai. Okay. So anyway, there were probably maybe 3 dozen or so sets of cards that came with a particular set that I have. And these are some versions of fabric woven on a takadai like this, again, diagonal and not so very wide. We're actually talking about 8 inches or so, 9 inches wide in these particular samples. So again, from my collection, this is a set of samples basically that came from either a school or a company that was producing them for order, like a sales catalog. And you can see that it just covers every type of kumi-himo that this particular institution produced. They're all done in red and white to be able to follow the course of the threads easily. You have flat ones, you have ones produced on a marudai, kakudai, ayagata dai, ayatake dai, as well as the takadai itself. Okay, just a whole range. So this gives you basically a very good set of inspirational pieces to follow as you're planning your own project. Okay, and then the final set here. So again, this may be produced, samples produced on all 4 types of looms, all four types of stands. And most of these would be used for ties around obis to help keep them in place, something that would be called obishime. Okay, that gives you a good variety, a good range of styles there. So this is one of those varieties. Here again, if I stop for just a moment, you'll see that this is woven on the diagonal, not the flat. It's knotted on the diagonal like this. So that would be a type, for example, that would have been produced on a takadai. And here you can see the carved wood, or sometimes it's paper, that has been lacquered. And this is going to be part of a suit of armor, the type that I showed you earlier, with the lacings holding everything together. And this is an antique piece, of course. And this will give you an example of what it looks like actually in use on a young warrior. And so these different platelets here are all held together so that there's quite a bit of flexibility in them. Now, quite often Japanese craftspeople, merchants, are trying to figure out things that can be used in a contemporary setting since they're no longer really manufacturing suits of armor any longer. So this was an interesting attempt at that. You can see that in this case, lacquered metal plates, okay, are all done in ridges, as you saw with the armor, and all of these ridges are laced together, just as you saw on the wing of the armament a moment ago. And the white portion here is deer skin that's been traditionally stamped. This type of leather was also used in suits of armor. So they're taking all of the traditional crafts, the lacquering, the knotting, the leather that was used in the suit of armor to create a woman's clutch. I don't know if it was a hot seller or not, but it is an interesting use of the equipment, use of the techniques, and so I'm glad to have it as part of my collection. A lot of this knotting that I've mentioned so far, I've talked about them making it very dense, okay, very tightly packed. Well, of course, there are times like with this summer obi tie that you want to have it more open. Well, in that case, you need to use a much heavier cord, a much more wiry kind of cord. Okay, it's still silk, but that allows it to remain open. You can still tie it and put some stress on it without having it collapse. But again, the key is having a much heavier wiry cord. Now, this gives the same general effect without the openness. And here again, we see another obishime, excuse me, obiage, which is one of the cords for the obi. And this one has many different techniques. It's a very complex knotting technique, all brought together in one cord. This one looks very serpentine, actually, very serpent-like in its feel. You can see here that these are all diagonal lines, and it's going as a hollow tube. Okay, so think of it a little bit like spool knitting when it's like this. Other contemporary uses, trying to make use of the knotting, would be table centers, of course, is a nice, beautiful way to put your collection on display. So what they've done in this case to create this yardage-like table center is to go along and create several different panels and then stitch them together to create one bit of yardage. Okay, and they could easily have been done on different looms too. So here you see the diagonal weave, which would have been done on a takadai. And then you see the undulating lines here that could have easily been done on a marudai or a kakudai. Now, the one thing here, let me back up just a tiny bit for clarity. Notice here, the different panels have been machine zigzagged. Okay, so they're taking these ribbons basically and stitching them all together to make the yardage. Okay, and this gives you a little bit better view of that. Okay, so it's a very beautiful one. Now, this is the back. This is the lining to the obi we just saw. So let me back up a fraction here. Okay, this is the obi itself, very, very wide. So if this were going to be done on a takadai, it would need to have many, many pegs to allow for a great many more bobbins to achieve this width. And because this is a finished, constructed fukuro obi, it has a backing to it. Now, the backing is not kumihimo. The backing is a type of undulate, okay, referred to as nami-ori, so it looks like wave pieces, and we'll be covering that in another talk at a later date. Okay, this just gives you a bit more idea of some of the diagonal knotting techniques. This particular obi is a brand new piece, it's never used, and so it still had all the paperwork with it. And in this particular case, you can see that the company is pushing that idea that they have this long history and affiliating themselves way back with these treasures from the Shosoin, and you can see it's exactly the same knotting techniques that were used then. Now, the nice thing when you get something new like this is even during the sewing process, they generally will give you all of the scraps back. So you might be buying a brand new obi and it might be already completed when you buy it. It doesn't matter. Any scraps associating with producing it are part of that purchase. And so that you have them as reference, either record keeping, or if there's a spot and the spot removing company needs to test some of their spot removing chemicals to make sure it'll work, they can test on the scrap rather than on the obi itself and risk damaging something. Okay, so there are lots of good reasons to have this. So you can see there's the face of the obi here with its diagonal knotting. You can see there's that nami-ori background. You can see in the nami-ori that the warp threads are all this laminated gilding. Okay, and there are also gilded threads within the weave itself. So that allows us to look at it more closely through magnification. You can see because it's a diagonal weave, there's quite a bit of stretch to it. And you can pick it apart, put it under a magnifying glass. If you're so inclined, you can test the dyes with chemicals or whatever, but do all of that with the scrap rather than damage your treasured finished piece. So let's leave the hand knotting for just a minute and go into this fascinating realm of industrial kumihimo. Look at this whole dance, this township of bobbins dancing together to create this communal piece of artistry. It's a little bit like a communal maypole in a sense, where everybody's coordinated in their dancing, only this is mechanized. Now, this is what allows them to do some of these very, very wide pieces. This is all controlled by the punch cards, very much as a traditional jacquard loom would be. And here we see more of that. I could easily get lost and mesmerized by this, watching it all day long, a little bit like being at the fairgrounds watching people go by, I suppose. Now, this is a finished piece from that process. You'll notice that there were a great many bobbins. Well, it doesn't necessarily mean there were that many cords. Each bobbin had its own strand of thread, and sometimes several threads were combined to create one cord. Now, this is a shawl, okay, that would go with a kimono. So you saw the lining backing. And this is a piece I've unstitched from another bolt of a similar fabric. And as you look, if you look carefully, you'll be able to see, here, let me stop this for a moment. There's a sharper image, back just a tiny bit. Okay, I think that's about as sharp as I'm going to get. You can see that each one of these cords that are knotted has many, many colors. So if they're 5, 1, 2, 3, maybe 5 or 6 in this one strand, then of course that would have been one of each of those bobbins that were going back and forth to twist that thread as it goes up into the knotting apparatus. But there's something else that we need to consider. I mentioned how tightly they're beating these cords to make them very dense weaves. Okay, so now we're back at a weave that's not dense. It's open, it's light, it's clothing. You don't want it to be like a board on your back. You want it to drape nicely. Well, the problem with that is, especially on the diagonal weaves, is there's a tendency for them to stretch out and crinkle in as stress is put on them. So in the weaving process itself, you have this additional, you can see this black thread here, this additional piece that acts a bit like a warp thread. And what that does is, no matter how your threads are crossed diagonally, this doesn't allow it to stretch out. Well, at this point, technically, it's a triaxial weave. You're using 3 axes to create your weave, but it's still the Kumihimo technique. So it's not a very big leap from the traditional Kumihimo to this triaxial version of it. And this allows you to have very open, drapey types of textiles. And this is the type of thing that would be used for. It's used for haori, michiyuki, hippari, like this one, all different types of garments, and shawls and so forth. Now, this is basically the same weave, only in this case, they've done it with the very stiff threads, okay? And so you can follow our white cord here. This is a summer obi, and you can follow that's white cord is our diagonal, and in between that diagonal is our blue diagonal, and then you can see running this entire length is that warp-like thread, keeping everything from stretching out. And if you look down below, you get this beautiful Star of David pattern in here, a hexagonal pattern, okay, with our long warp pattern here and our 2 diagonals. Since this is a summer obi, you want something open, airy, light, but it's still, since you can't line it and you can't interface it, it needs to be stiff enough to hold its own body and shape, and therefore these stiffer cords. Okay, this one too is a very open piece, you can see. But let's take a look at the detail now. This one doesn't have that long warp light. I'm going to stop here for a minute. This long warp light thread. Okay, that's missing here. Now, what it does have is this, and it's not technically a weft, but it has this weft-like piece if you follow this additional thread that meanders through, creating its own pattern. So then this is truly a triaxial weave at this point. And you can see these ribbons have been used in combination with the gilded threads. But look at the background here. Perhaps on your screen, you can see this tiny mesh in between each of the cross hatches. Okay. The open weave, not having that long weft, the long warp stabilizing factor, it's been laminated, attached to a very lightweight gauze background. And that's what stabilizes it. Now, that can be done with a stabilizing like Wonder Under type web if you want a fusible bond, okay? Or it can be stitched on, is another way of doing it. The stitched on being the higher quality, of course. This piece too is very open, much as the last one was, but let's take a look at it. You can see that these islands are very dense. They're not open at all, but you have these perforated sections. Okay, this dense area, coupled with a very heavy yarn at this point, a stiff yarn, allows it to be open without that backing and without the stabilizing warp-like yarn. So this goes back to sort of the true older type of Kumihimo. This is the particular sample that was included in your Textile of the Month kit this month. And you'll see that it too is very open, very mesh-like. These are very soft threads. You can see they're not spun tightly at all. But this piece too has been laminated to another piece of yardage in the back. Now, I've forgotten at the moment, I apologize, whether I peeled off that backing so that you could see the back of your fabric or not. It may be in place. If it's in place, good. You know the purpose it's serving. And if it's gone, just know that it was there originally. And this is a very similar piece to the sample you received. The difference being we are back at very stiff, very rigid cords that have been knotted for this summer obi. And you can see they maintain their structure in this very spider web-like knotting technique. Okay, and then going back to the all diagonal, the different colors, of course, helps you to see exactly what's happening here much better. And if we look closely, you can see that running through the middle here is this white line, which is our stabilizing warp-like thread. So again, this is a triaxial. Now this one, as it happens, is not a triaxial. This is a strictly diagonal only piece. It's very tightly compressed during the knotting process, using that beater bar to do so. And this, again, is more of a summerish obi, but it doesn't have any lining. It has no backing. It needs to maintain the integrity of its structure just with the thread, the stiffness, and the density of the weave. Okay, and yet another, very similar to the one we just saw. The difference being this one has a little bit lighter thread. You can see it's not spun as tightly, they're not as heavy, and therefore it needs an interfacing and it needs a lining. But this one too was done in these narrow strips. So very likely each of these strips was done on a takadai as narrow bits. And then once the craftsperson finished these seemingly miles of ribbon, go back and stitch them together with the machine sewing zigzag to hold the panels together to create one beautiful obi. And a nice backing to it as well. Okay, so thank you for joining me today. That'll do it for our public talk, and we'll go ahead and sign off now so that the rest of you in the Textile of the Month group can go ahead and join me with questions, answers, and other discussions. All right, thank you again for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.